Most of my families never came in the form of yelling or slamming doors. It came quietly, disguised as concern, as tradition, as expectations no one asked if I agreed to. My name's Carson. I'm 34, and I live alone on the 22nd floor of a glass-paneled apartment tower on the west end of Phoenix, Arizona. It's not the biggest place, but it's high enough to keep most of the noise down and spacious enough that I can work late without pacing between furniture. My job isn't glamorous by any stretch, but after 10 years in the logistics grind, I got promoted to director of operations at a regional shipping firm, which sounds fancier than it is, but it pays $137,000 a year and gives me enough quiet in the evenings to pretend I'm content. I don't have much of a social life, and truth be told, I haven't visited my parents in over 3 months, mostly because our conversations tend to orbit around my younger brother, Toby, like he's some fragile celestial object that might collapse if not properly admired. The last time I dropped by, my dad spent 20 minutes ranting about gas prices while Toby scrolled through his phone, and my mom barely noticed when I mentioned I had taken on 3 new clients in a single week. It's always been that way. Growing up, I was the kid who figured things out while Toby was the one being rescued. That pattern followed us into adulthood. He still lives at home and drifts between ventures that never quite pan out, while I file quarterly reports and manage over 100 staff across 4 state branches. So when I got promoted 3 weeks ago, I didn't tell them immediately. Not because I didn't want to, but because I wanted to believe, for once, that maybe they'd ask about my life before I offered anything. But after a few days of holding it in, I decided to go over there. I picked up a nice bottle of Syrah from a boutique place near my office and swung by a pastry shop my mom always liked when I was in college. It wasn't any special occasion, at least not for them, so I didn't call ahead. I figured if I walked in with a smile and some good news, they'd be happy to see me. When I pulled into the driveway around 7:30 that Friday evening, the porch light was on, but the living room was dark. My dad opened the door after I knocked twice, squinting like I'd woken him from something more important. He just stared for a second and then said, "Didn't know you were coming." My mom peeked around the corner from the kitchen and gave me a curious look, but didn't come out. We sat down for dinner about 30 minutes later. Nothing fancy, some reheated meatloaf and overcooked rice, but I didn't mind. I brought out the wine after we ate, poured 3 glasses, and waited until we were all seated before I said it. I got promoted last week, I told them. Director of operations. For a moment, neither of them said anything. My dad nodded slowly and muttered, "That's good. Congratulations." My mom looked down at her glass and said, "If only Toby had your luck." I stared at her for a second, hoping she was joking, but the silence afterward made it clear she wasn't. I left not long after that. Told them I had an early morning, but the truth is I couldn't stand sitting there a minute longer pretending that what I said hadn't just vanished into some emotional void. That night, I drove home with the radio off, the streets melting past my windshield like it was someone else's life unfolding. I wasn't angry exactly, just hollow. Not because they didn't celebrate, but because I realized they probably never would, at least not for me. For a few days after that, I buried myself in work, hoping it'd help me forget the feeling of being a guest in the house I grew up in. Then on Wednesday morning, around 10:45, I got a call from my mom. She almost never calls me during the day, so I stepped out of the office and answered. Her tone was different, soft, almost sugary, and before I could ask what was going on, she said, "Carson, why don't you come to dinner this Sunday? We want to celebrate your promotion. Just a small family gathering." I didn't hesitate. The wound from last weekend hadn't healed, but something about her voice made me want to believe she was trying to fix it. I even smiled. Said sure, I'd be there. She sent me the restaurant details an hour later. A place called La Vie Brine, not a spot I'd usually pick, mostly because it was in the heart of the city and the kind of place that charged $60 for a plate of halibut. I looked it up anyway. The website had gold accents, a French jazz soundtrack auto-playing in the background, and a 3-week wait list for peak hours. I figured she must have planned it ahead of time, which was strange, since she'd only just called me. But I shrugged it off. Maybe they wanted to make it special. I try not to overthink it. Sunday came. I ironed my best shirt, picked a dark blazer, and drove out just before sunset. The restaurant sat beneath a rooftop garden, with valet service and a hostess in a velvet gown who greeted me by name. She walked me to a long table in the back, where I found not just my parents and Toby, but two uncles, three aunts, five cousins, and a few people I barely recognized from my childhood. They clapped when I arrived. Someone even whistled. I smiled, trying to hide how off balance I felt. I wasn't expecting a crowd. I thought it was just dinner. I sat near the end of the table beside my cousin Joel, who asked how work was going and then immediately launched into how his startup could use someone with your skills and connections. I gave him a polite laugh and said we'd talk later. A few others joined in. One cousin wanted help getting her daughter into corporate. Another asked if I knew anyone hiring. I nodded, kept my answers vague, and tried to focus on the wine, which was excellent. They brought out lobster bisque, seared scallops, crab salad, halibut with beurre blanc, and 6 bottles of white from all sauce that I knew cost over $80 each. Around course 3, I started to do some mental math. There were 20 people at the table, maybe more. Even being conservative, this meal was pushing toward $4,000. Still, I didn't say anything. When the bill came, I'd offer to pitch in, maybe $1,000. It felt like the right thing to do, especially since I'd been invited in my name. I even felt a little guilty for suspecting my parents earlier. Maybe they really were trying, and this was their way of making up for the awkward dinner at home. I had no idea what was coming next. Nothing about that night prepared me for the moment the check landed on the table, because that was when everything started to unravel. The server came by just after dessert with a small folder in hand, resting it carefully in front of my mother like she was the host of some private gala. She didn't even glance at it before announcing in a voice that made every conversation at the table pause. The total tonight is $4,689.70. The moment she said that, I blinked, not surprised by the number, but more by the fact that she'd said it so clearly in front of everyone, as if it were meant to impress the crowd. I glanced at my dad, who sat beside her, calm and silent, as if none of this had anything to do with him. That's when I spoke up. I smiled lightly and said, "Thanks for throwing this together. I'd like to pitch in. Let me cover 1,000. I reached into my jacket to pull out my wallet, thinking that was the end of it. What happened next made my stomach turn. My mother stiffened, looked directly at me, and asked, "Are you being serious right now?" I gave a nervous chuckle, still trying to keep the mood light, and replied, "Why wouldn't I be? It's a thank you." She didn't return the smile. "This dinner is for you, Carson," she said, "and you're only covering 1,000. Her voice was firm, but not loud, like a knife slipped in a conversation without anyone else realizing. Before I could respond, my father leaned forward, not with anger, but with the kind of authority that shuts everything down before it starts. "You're paying for the whole thing," he said, his eyes not leaving mine. The table went silent. No laughter, no clinking of glasses. Just 20 faces all turning toward me at once, waiting to see what I'd say. I took a second. I needed it. I said, "Hold on. I thought this was your idea. You invited me, remember? Mom said you wanted to celebrate." That's when my cousin Eli, who was halfway down the table, piped up, his voice cutting through the awkward air like a blade. "Wait, you didn't plan this?" he asked, clearly confused. "Your mom told my dad that Carson was hosting, that he invited everyone to dinner." You could feel the shift in the room. Aunt Marlene immediately leaned over to hiss something at Eli, probably telling him to shut his mouth, but it was too late. The truth was already out, and suddenly everything clicked. They didn't throw this dinner for me. They threw it with me as the financial bait. Every single smile, every raised glass, every forced compliment. It was all part of a setup, and now that it had reached the check, the trap was supposed to snap shut. I could feel my ears burning, but I kept my tone flat. "That's not what happened," I said. "I was told this was a family celebration. I didn't plan this, and I didn't agree to pay for the entire thing." Then came the real blow. Toby leaned back in his seat, arms crossed, and said, "Unbelievable. You finally get a real job, and now you're acting like it's a burden to treat your family?" I turned slowly to look at him. The nerve. The same brother who'd spent 3 years floating between business ideas that led nowhere, living rent-free at our parents' house, working part-time shifts at places he never lasted more than a few weeks, was now calling me selfish for not footing a $5,000 dinner. And the worst part? My parents didn't say a word to correct him. Uncle Rob joined in next. We came out here tonight for you, Carson. Some of us even left work early. Then Aunt Marlene added, you make more than most of us combined. This isn't going to break you. At that point, it wasn't even about the money anymore. I could afford it. That wasn't the issue. What tore at me was the gall, the expectation that I would just roll over, swipe my card, and smile like they'd done me a favor. I looked around and said, I'll pay for my share. Let's just split it. That's fair. That's when my dad slammed his palm against the table. Not loud enough to draw attention from other diners, but sharp enough to shut down any remaining conversation. You got promoted, he said. You pay the bill. That's how this works. He leaned in, his voice dropping into something colder than anger. And if you're too cheap to cover one meal, then don't bother coming back to this family. Don't show your face in our house again. For a second, I couldn't breathe. Not because he yelled, but because I realized what I was hearing. Over one dinner bill, one setup disguised as generosity, my father was ready to banish me from the family entirely. I didn't even get a warning, a moment of private tension. He made the declaration with the whole table watching, like a sentence passed by a king in front of his court. I looked at the server, who'd been standing quietly nearby, holding her tablet awkwardly, her expression caught between patience and panic. She'd been waiting for over 10 minutes to process the check. And in that moment, I couldn't bring myself to let her stand there in the middle of this humiliating disaster. I called her over, pulled my card from my wallet, and handed it to her. She took it without a word, retreated to the counter, and came back with the receipt. As I signed it, I added a $100 tip. Not because I wanted to be generous, but because I knew she didn't deserve to be pulled into this circus. That's when Toby muttered under his breath, "You'll tip a server, but won't take care of your own family." What a joke. That was it. I looked straight at him, and in the lowest voice I've ever used in public, I said, "Shut your mouth." Her attitude is worth more than everyone at this table combined. He blinked, stunned. For the first time that night, he didn't have a comeback. The silence that followed felt like a collapsed lung, heavy, uncomfortable, pressing in from every direction. I took my card back, tucked the receipt into my wallet, and stood up. My mother glanced at the card as if she'd just noticed the metallic shine. "Nice card," she said. "You should get a second one and add me." I didn't answer, didn't smile, didn't even nod. I just turned, looked across the long table one last time, and said, "Don't expect me at any family gatherings from now on." I walked out without waiting for a reply. No one followed. No one called my name. It was like I ceased to exist the moment I refused to play along. The drive home was quiet. Not the calm kind of quiet that comes after a long day, but the heavy, punishing kind like a door had shut behind me, and I wasn't sure what kind of place I'd walked into next. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the couch, lights off, staring at the ceiling and wondering if it had always been this way and I just hadn't noticed. Because if someone's love can vanish the moment you say no, then maybe it was never love to begin with. The silence after that night was longer than I expected, but also strangely welcome. For the first time in a long while, my phone wasn't buzzing with family group messages, passive-aggressive comments disguised as jokes, or awkward guilt trips sandwiched between fake concern. I went back to work Monday morning and focused entirely on the one part of my life that had never demanded more than I offered. Logistics might not be flashy, but it makes sense. There are numbers, timelines, cause, and effect. If something breaks, you find the origin. If something's missing, you track it down. With people, it's never that simple. By Thursday, I had almost convinced myself that the dinner fiasco would fade into the background. Maybe they were embarrassed. Maybe they realized they'd gone too far. Or maybe, more realistically, they assumed I'd cool off and return quietly to the family circuit like I always had after previous offenses. But then my mom called at 10:12 on a Saturday morning, her name lighting up the screen while I was finishing a grocery run. I stood in the cereal aisle for almost 30 seconds, just staring at it, debating whether to swipe it away or brace for whatever came next. I picked up, half expecting a forced apology or at least some lukewarm attempt at reconciliation. But her voice came through with the same composed tone she used when she wanted something, calm and direct like nothing had happened between us. "Carson, your brother needs some help," she said. "He's got a chance to invest with a friend, and we need you to help him out." No hello. No acknowledgement of the dinner. No questions about how I was doing. Just a number, a need, and the assumption I'd be the one to fix it. I asked, "How much are we talking about?" Her answer came without hesitation. $47,000. I let the silence hang there until it got uncomfortable. Then I asked, "Why isn't Toby calling me himself? Why are you asking for him?" She paused. "What does it matter who asks? He needs help. You're in the best position to give it." I didn't raise my voice. I just said, "I don't have that kind of money." She didn't miss a beat. "Yes, you do. You were just promoted. You're making good money now." I said nothing. She kept going. "Why are you being so selfish?" That word hit harder than I expected. Not because it hurt, but because I realized how often they'd used it whenever I said no. I ended the call without another word. That night, around 8:30, the doorbell rang. I checked the hallway camera and saw both my mother and Toby standing at my door. They weren't holding anything. Not food, not an envelope, not even the pretense of a gift. Just stone faces, tight lips, and eyes that told me this visit wasn't going to be about peace. I thought about not opening it, but my apartment walls are thin and I didn't want a scene. So I unlocked the door and let them in. My mom marched straight to the living room like it was still her house. Toby followed without looking at me. She sat down and began without even removing her coat. "We came here to apologize for how things ended at the dinner," she said, carefully choosing words that could later be rewritten if needed. "That wasn't how we meant it to go." I waited. I looked at them both and asked, "If you're really sorry, are you planning to pay me back for that night?" Toby cut in instantly, voice low and almost pleading. "You know we don't have the money." I laughed. Not loudly, not bitterly, but in that empty way that comes when you finally stop pretending to be surprised. "Then why are you really here?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. They danced around it for 2 more minutes, talked about family, talked about opportunities, talked about how important it is to lift each other up. And then the ask came again, just like I expected. "Toby needs that investment," my mom said. "It's a one-time opportunity." This time, I didn't say no outright. I told them I'd consider it, under one condition. It would be a loan with a formal agreement and my parents would co-sign. The contract would include clear terms, repayment deadlines, and interest based on market standards. The moment I said that, my mom's eyes flared like I'd slapped her. "You're seriously charging your own family interest?" she snapped. Toby's voice followed, sharper now. "You've really become a jerk. You have money, and yet you act like you're some poor stranger." I didn't argue. I just stared at them and said, "No real family invites you to a dinner they didn't pay for, then makes you foot the bill. And no real family praises one child while treating the other like a backup bank account." That shut them up. Not because they were ashamed, but because the script had flipped and they didn't know their lines anymore. I walked toward the door, held it open, and said, "If you don't leave, I'll call the police." My mom rose slowly, not saying a word. Toby hesitated, then followed behind her. Neither of them looked back. I shut the door, locked it, and didn't move for a full minute. 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed. It was my cousin Marcus. He never calls that late, so I picked up. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "I don't know what's going on exactly," he said, "but my mom was on the phone with yours just now." She didn't realize I was in the room. I didn't hear everything, but I caught enough to know something's off. I didn't interrupt. He continued. "They were talking about that money. I think your mom's trying to use Toby's name as an excuse. It sounded like there's some personal debt they're trying to cover." I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling while Marcus kept talking. He said, "They mentioned something about a sure thing, some kind of investment, but it didn't sound real. Your name came up like you'd already agreed." I thanked him and ended the call. I sat there, staring at nothing, every piece of the night clicking into place. The apology wasn't real. The visit wasn't sincere. It was a setup, one more trap, dressed differently this time, but with the same intention. Corner me, guilt me, get the money. Without hesitating, I pulled up my contacts and called my mother. She answered quickly, like she'd been waiting for the call. "Carson, I knew you'd come around. You're going to help, right?" I didn't waste a second. "Don't bother lying. I know what's going on. I know the money isn't for Toby. I know about the call. Don't insult me any further." She paused, then said, You're misunderstanding things. I'm your mother. I hung up. Then I opened my family chat, left every group, and blocked every number. No explanation, no warning, no message. I just shut it all down. And when I placed my phone face down on the table, something inside me finally settled. Not with anger, not with satisfaction, just with the quiet, final understanding that I didn't owe these people anything. Not explanations, not excuses, not another chance. The fallout wasn't dramatic at first. No screaming voicemails, no knocks on the door, no sudden family interventions. What I got instead was silence. That specific kind of silence that feels less like distance and more like someone waiting behind a curtain, expecting you to beg for them to come out. I wasn't playing. I'd already made peace with what I walked away from. That's why, when my phone lit up with a notification from a coworker the following Thursday afternoon, I didn't expect anything serious. Just a message. Dude, have you seen this Reddit post? There was a link under it. No explanation. Just curiosity, vague and unfinished. I clicked on it without thinking too much, but the moment the page loaded, I froze. The title alone made my stomach twist. My older brother Carson just abandoned our whole family because we asked him for help. It had already been up for 8 hours. Thousands of views, hundreds of comments. The username was anonymous, but the details inside made it obvious. There was no question who wrote it. It was Toby. The entire post read like a carefully rehearsed sob story. It painted me as some stone-hearted executive who couldn't be bothered to help his struggling family, who made 6 figures and still let our mother cry on the floor after he screamed at her like a stranger. He described the dinner like it was a gift I spat on, claimed everyone had pitched in to celebrate me, and I had responded by throwing a tantrum about the cost. No mention of how I was told to pay the entire bill. No word about the lie that I'd hosted the dinner. Just paragraph after paragraph, twisting every truth until it barely resembled reality. I sat at my desk staring at the screen, my coffee going cold. There were comments defending him. Others saying I sounded entitled. Some people even tried to figure out who I was, piecing together my job, income, and even city based on the crumbs he dropped. The worst part wasn't the lies. It was how calculated the whole thing felt. Like he'd waited until enough time had passed, until things had settled, and then launched this quiet little grenade into the internet, hoping it would detonate in my absence. And I almost let it go. I closed the post, turned off my monitor, and told myself it didn't matter. But deep down, something had changed. They weren't just twisting my silence anymore. They were dragging my name, my work, my entire character through the mud in front of strangers. I pulled out my phone and called Connor. He's been my closest friend since college, now working as a civil and personal reputation lawyer in Austin. We've shared dorm rooms, apartment hunting nightmares, and half a dozen bad first dates between us. But I've never asked him for legal help. Not until now. He picked up after 3 rings. Carson, he said, this better be about drinks or something dumb. I didn't waste time. I need your help. Toby just posted about me online. He used my name, my income, my job title. It's spreading fast. There was a long pause on the other end. Connor's voice shifted instantly. Send me the link. Right now. I forwarded it. Less than 10 minutes later, he called back, all business. This is defamation. The post is public. Your details are obvious. And he's causing measurable reputational damage. If we take this to court, we've got a case. He walked me through what we needed, screenshots of the post, every comment, every edit, every reply Toby made. We'll start with a takedown demand, Connor said, and a formal request for a public correction. If he ignores it, we file. I spent the next 2 hours capturing everything. I even caught Toby replying to someone in the comments saying, not everyone with money has a soul. Some people forget who fed them growing up. The comments beneath it were a mix of sympathy and skepticism, but that line was enough to prove malice. Connor's team sent the cease and desist within 24 hours. It went to Toby's email, his Reddit account, and a physical copy to my parents' house, just to make sure it couldn't be ignored. The waiting began. 3 days of silence, again. But this time, it wasn't stillness. It was that sharp pause before something snaps. On day 3, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. I didn't answer. They followed up with a text. You're seriously going to drag the whole family through court over something this petty? I didn't reply, because by that point, I realized they were never scared of losing me. They were scared of losing control over the narrative, of having their version publicly dismantled. Late that night, I opened Reddit again. The post had been edited, not deleted, not apologized for, just a new line added at the top in italic font. Edit. After speaking with my family, I realized some details may have been misrepresented. I apologize for any confusion this post caused. That was it. No admission of wrongdoing. No specifics. And conveniently, the post stayed up. The lies remained. The story still painted me as the villain. Only now, it was shielded by a vague disclaimer written in legal tone. But people weren't stupid. The comments changed almost immediately. Why not just delete it if it's inaccurate? One person asked. Sounds like a lawsuit happened, someone else added. Others began questioning everything. The mood shifted. Sympathy turned to doubt. People started searching for the original version of the post, digging through archives, pointing out contradictions. If your brother really screamed at your mom, why would she visit him days later? Someone asked. Another replied, feels like you left out a lot of context. I scrolled through every line, reading the turn in real time. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt nothing, because winning wasn't the point. I hadn't wanted revenge. I'd wanted peace. I just didn't want to be misrepresented anymore. I texted Connor. He posted the edit. His reply came within seconds. Told you. These people fold the second someone holds up a mirror. That night, I left the office late. Instead of going straight home, I stopped by a quiet bar near my place. Sat at the counter, ordered a whiskey, and let myself sit in silence for the first time in days. While I stared into the amber glass, I thought about something I had never let myself admit before. Most of my family's abuse never came in the form of yelling or slamming doors. It came quietly, disguised as concern, as tradition, as expectations no one asked if I agreed to. The dinner, the manipulation, the guilt. None of it was ever direct. But now, finally, I wasn't playing along. I walked home that night, feeling a kind of calm I hadn't known in years. Because even though the story was still out there, even though the internet never forgets, something had shifted. They knew they couldn't write the story without consequences anymore. They knew I had drawn the line. By the end of that week, everything felt quieter, not like peace, but like an engine finally shutting down after running too hot for too long. Connor filed paperwork to keep things documented, just in case they tried anything else, and I kept my distance. I didn't open any family messages, didn't unblock anyone, didn't give them the chance to spin a new version. And for a while, nothing happened. No new posts, no indirect texts from cousins, not even one of those guilt-laced check-ins pretending to be about my well-being. It was a Tuesday night when I got the last message I'd ever received from them. It wasn't from my mom or Toby, but from a distant aunt I barely remembered from childhood gatherings. You've embarrassed your family enough. They were just trying to build something. Everyone struggles. You should have helped. I stared at the words for a moment, not angry, just surprised they were still trying to pretend this was ever about survival instead of control. I deleted the message and blocked her too. It didn't hurt. It didn't sting. It just confirmed I was right to let go. Weeks passed, then a few months. I focused on work, hit a record quarter, and got offered a speaking opportunity at a national logistics summit. I started sleeping better. I started laughing more. Sometimes with friends. Sometimes with no one. One night, I even signed up for a cooking class just to fill the space that had been eaten by obligations I never agreed to. That's when I realized I wasn't just recovering, I was rebuilding. One night, Marcus called. Just wanted to say you did the right thing, he said. Some of us were watching. We saw what they did. We just didn't know how to speak up without getting dragged into it. I told him I appreciated that, and I meant it, because truthfully, I didn't need everyone to agree with me. I just needed someone to acknowledge it wasn't in my head. Months later, Connor and I met up again at the same bar where I first told him everything. We ordered the same drinks, sat in the same spot, but this time there was no urgency, no legal prep, no strategy. Just two old friends talking about the future like it wasn't weighed down by the past. He raised his glass and said, "So what's next?" I thought about it for a moment, then answered the only way I could. Whatever I choose. If you made it this far, thanks for reading. I didn't post this for sympathy or revenge. I shared it because silence is what abusers count on. They rely on your reluctance to cause a scene, to break the illusion, to make it real. They train you to think setting a boundary makes you cruel. But here's what I've learned. Protecting your peace is not cruelty, it's clarity. Walking away from manipulation isn't betrayal, it's survival. People always ask the same thing when they hear about the dinner. Was it really worth cutting off your family over a few $1,000s? And to that I say no. It wasn't about the money. It was about finally understanding that some people will only treat you as valuable when you're doing something for them. And the second you stop, you become the enemy. So no, I didn't walk away because of one dinner. I walked away because after years of small wounds, that dinner was the one where I finally saw the knife.